Hi everyone, so let's talk a little bit about collision detection. Doing pixel-perfect collision detection is fairly difficult, so what we're going to do in this video is actually a much simpler kind of collision detection. But hopefully it will give you enough ideas that you could make it more exact if you wanted to later. So here's what the game looks like right now. We have two different kinds of collisions we want to detect. We want to detect whether or not the asteroids are colliding with the player, and then later on, when we shoot bullets, we want to know, are any of the bullets we've shot hitting any of the asteroids that exist? So let's tackle the player first. So what we want to ask is the question, is any asteroid hitting the player? But remember, all of our asteroids are inside a big list of all the asteroids. So if we're trying to do something with all of the asteroids, we need to do it one at a time for each asteroid in the list. So, for example, imagine each of these 4 asteroids is here inside our asteroids list. You need to use the pattern where you loop over all the locations in the list, and then you get a particular asteroid out of the list, save it into a variable, and then it would be really convenient if we could just ask the question using a method directly. If we ask, is the asteroid we're looking at right now, is it hitting the player? So, if we're going to do something like that, then we'll need an isHitting method inside GameObj so that we can have the asteroid GameObj run the isHitting method. And as an input, it needs to take another GameObj so that we can look at that GameObj and ask, is the one running the method hitting this other one that's the input? And if it is, we can do stuff, like we might remove hit points, or we might decrease score, or we might remove the asteroid from the world, something like that. Represented a little bit more graphically, the idea is, again, each of these arrows, we're going to grab each of these asteroids one at a time in the loop and save them. This time I've changed the variable name to Bob. So it's like I'll take this asteroid and I'll put it in the Bob variable, and then I'll ask, is Bob hitting the player? Okay, so let's think about how this looks different for bullets. For bullet, I need to loop over every single bullet, and for each of the bullets, I need to loop over all of the asteroids and ask if it's hitting any of the asteroids. So that's 2 loops. For each bullet, loop over the asteroids. If a particular bullet is hitting a particular asteroid, then remove both. So that looks something like this. I loop over all the locations in the bullets list, and I get out each bullet one at a time. And then once I have my bullet, I loop over all the asteroids, and I get out an asteroid. And then I can ask, is my bullet hitting my asteroid? So, one thing you've noticed is both of those ideas use an isHitting method. So let's take a look at how the isHitting method works. The whole point of isHitting is it will return true or false, yes or no, is a particular game object that's running the method hitting another one. So we're going to use a very simple technique that builds off of what you did last time. You already have a method that will check are some set of XY coordinates inside your GameObj or are they outside the GameObj. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at XY coordinates for particular key points on a game object. Key points might be points along the outside, so like the top middle, the bottom middle, the left, and the right. So we're going to check the XY coordinates for each of those points on one game object and ask, is this top point inside the other game object? Because if this red point is inside this game object, they're probably hitting each other. And we're going to do that for all 4 points. So let me show you what that looks like inside the game for a minute. So here I've drawn green boxes around all the objects, and they're moving slowly so we can see what's happening. So notice here, nothing's turning red because it doesn't think that they're hitting each other, even though if you look at the images, they clearly are hitting each other. So next I'm going to let that little green dot in the middle pass into the box surrounding my player, the box surrounding the ship, and you'll see what happens. Everything's going to turn red. There it is. So when everything turns red, that's the sign that the computer thinks that things are hitting each other. And so what I want you to focus on is, notice exactly when does everything turn red and when does it not. It turns red exactly when the green dot enters the box for my ship. But if I let it if I make it so that the green dot avoids the box, even though the images are overlapping, it doesn't think any collisions are happening. So this is an example of why you want more than one key point to detect whether or not collisions are happening, because here I can make lots of collisions happen, but the computer doesn't see them. So I'm going to change it right now to add a couple of more points, and you'll see what change happens. So notice now all the objects have 3 points. And so now it's a lot easier for the computer to tell if they're hitting each other. But this is still not perfect, because right at the beginning there, the asteroid is the boxes are barely overlapping, and so the computer thinks that there's a collision happening long before the image actually touches the other image. So this one isn't perfect either. So if you wanted to use this approach to make a better detection, you would need to do something like change the hitbox for the player, and then be very careful about which points you are selecting on the asteroids as your tests. But let's make this one before we make a more advanced one, because the more advanced one is kind of complicated. So that was the idea. What does this look like in code? It's going to look something like this. So inside the GameObj class, we want an isHitting method. It's going to return true or false, because it's asking the question, is something hitting us? And the input is the other GameObj. So I'm asking, is the other GameObj hitting us? You've already written a method called ContainsPoint, or some people called it isHittingPoint. So we're going to have we're going to ask the other object, do you contain the point? And then we're going to give it one of the xy coordinates for a key point for us. So this.x, this.y returns the xy coordinates of the very center. So here, if the asteroid is the one running the isHitting method, I'd give it the player as input, just like we did way back here. So I'm looping over all the asteroids. Whoops. I'm looping over all the asteroids. Bob is an asteroid, so I'm asking Bob, are you hitting the player? So the input object is player, and an asteroid is the one running isHitting. So here, if the asteroid's running isHitting, if I say this.x, this.y, it's the xy coordinates of the particular asteroid that's running this method. And other object is the player object, because that's the one that was input to this method. So I'm asking the player object, do you contain the point? And then I'm giving it my own center. And then if I wanted to add more points, I could check other points with more if statements. So is the player containing the point? And then this corresponds to the top point here for my asteroid. So it's this.x, which is the center x, and then this.y minus half the image height takes me up to the top. So if it contains the point, I return true, because that means something's hitting me. Otherwise, down here at the very end, I would need to return false, because nothing's hitting me. So if this were the only hit detection method we were going to use, how would we make it less obvious that it's not perfect? Well, one thing is, if these objects were moving a lot faster, then it wouldn't be so obvious that the collision detection was starting before the asteroid actually hits my player. It would just look like the asteroid sweeps across my player and I get hit. So that's a way of having the other aspects of the game hide the fact that our collision detection isn't perfect. Another thing you could do if you wanted to, right now we're asking, are any of the asteroid key points inside the player box? But the player box is pretty big for what that image looks like. So if we wanted to change the way that our ContainsPoint method works, we could actually make the box that it was checking in not extend all the way to the edges of the image. Instead, we could have a much smaller box that was centered on the very middle of our ship image. And we'd just check to see if any of the key asteroid points were inside that smaller box. That's enough for right now. Next video, I'll show you a different technique for for collision detection that checks whether or not two different rectangles are overlapping, which in some ways is a little bit nicer, but is also not going to give you perfect collision detection unless you do things that are particular to the individual images that you're using. Okay, thanks.